Good evening. Shalom. Thank you for joining me tonight. We're in now the third night of the Feast of Hanukkah. And whether you say Hanukkah or Hanukkah, which it is in Hebrew, it means dedication. Dedication is the name of the feast because we commemorate and celebrate the rededication of the temple in 164 BC. This was a fantastic, amazing, supernatural event wherein a tiny band of Jewish rebels overcame what probably was the most army in the world at that time. It was a great victory, a great miracle happened there. That's why we spin a dreidel with 4 letters on it. Stands for the acronym Nes Gadol Haya Sham. A great miracle happened there. And the liberation of the temple is so important to the Jewish people, but not just to the Jewish people, to the whole world. And the reason that it was so important at that time when it happened was because the Jews in the 2nd century BC believed that the Messiah was soon to come. God had already promised to David long before. I mean, we're talking about 850 years earlier that David lived. And God promised David that his offspring would always sit upon the throne of Israel. And his kingdom would be a kingdom that would last forever and ever. So the Jews always understood that the throne of David was an everlasting kingdom. And the only way that this could be fulfilled would be if David's seed came into the world as the Son of God, the Messiah, the heir to the throne of which God promised to David. So it hadn't happened. Since the time of Solomon, the nation of Israel had been divided, scattered. There was not, from Solomon onward, a united kingdom that lived free in the land. So the promise of Messiah meant that Israel would at last come out from under the yoke of foreign tyranny. Israel had come under Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, and later it would be Rome, but always trusting in the promise that Israel would be a free nation ruled by this king whose kingdom lasts forever and ever. And the Jews understood that as a promise, not just for them, but for the whole world. For out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem, for the good of all the earth, for the good of all humanity. The Messiah would come, make peace on earth, establish justice, mete out God's law from Jerusalem to bring harmony and peace to the whole world, end war, fill the world with love and understanding, and all the things that otherwise only poets and I guess hippies talk about. But this is the reality that is promised to the world in the Messianic kingdom. So it was intolerable, it was unfathomable that the temple in Jerusalem would come under the reign of a foreign power, not only under the reign, but literally in this generation that we're talking about in 164, a king from a remnant of the Greek Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, marched into Jerusalem, offered a pig upon the altar in the temple, and set up worship to Zeus. He also instituted laws throughout the land establishing idolatry as the system of worship, Greek idolatry throughout the land, Hellenized the land, meaning bringing it into a Greek culture instead of the biblical Jewish culture. And moreover, worst of all, really outlawed, Antiochus Epiphanes outlawed the basic laws of the Bible, which form the backbone of the Jewish culture. Things like the Shabbat, outlawed. The feasts of Yom Kippur, Passover, Sukkot, and so forth, outlawed. Circumcising newborns, outlawed. And if you broke any of these laws, you'd be subject to the death penalty. And many Jews were put to death at that time because of continuing to keep the biblical commandments that are common to the people Israel. So it became impossible to congregate for worship or congregate for Bible study, Torah study, without risking one's life. Now, we in this generation, we have no sense, no concept of what that would be like. And I personally don't want to have any concept of that. I hope that we never do, especially here in America. America was founded on the principle that there would be a free nation. The people that came to America, they mostly came from Europe. They were fleeing religious tyranny, religious persecution. People came here so that they could have the freedom to believe in and follow God in whatever way that God might put on their heart. It's been a land of freedom and a land that cherished and protects individuals' rights to have a personal relationship with God without government interference. And so this has worked wonderfully. This is amazing. It's an amazing success, America is. But now there are, as there were in the days of Judah Maccabee, there are people who are plotting in the world to try to take over countries like America, to take away our freedom, to institute laws that would outlaw the basic customs that the Maccabees fought over. The Sabbath, the feasts, the right to circumcise our children, to eat kosher foods and these things. But even if those ones that I just mentioned are not necessarily pertinent to your experience, just the basic, simple faith in the God of the Bible, in his son Yeshua, there are those who seek to outlaw that faith, to outlaw practicing anything associated with it, teaching it. We've already seen it removed from the schools, but that's not really what I'm referring to. I'm referring to this international terrorism that is part of a worldwide, apparently, I'm no expert on these things. I'm not an anti-terrorist expert, and I don't mean to sound like I am, but you don't have to be to see what's going on in the world today. There are people in the world that are conspiring to use terror to take over the world and establish what they call Sharia law, which is associated with Islam. It's oppressive. It's the Sharia law system. It's real clear what the fruit of it is. All you have to do is look at any of the Islamic nations like Syria or Iran, where basic rights are suppressed. Women are treated like slaves. People's hands are cut off, and people are put to death and tortured, and just all kinds of miserable, horrible things in the name of their religion. And so this is the backdrop of the whole Hanukkah story. You see, that imagine if you were told that everything would be okay as long as you adopted a new religion and obeyed new religious laws and bowed down to the Prophet Muhammad and worshiped the God Allah and this sort of thing. Everything would be okay if you did that. But if you refused to do that, you could be put to death or worse. Well, I hope to God that scenario never comes to be in the world anywhere, and certainly not in America. I hope to God that it never will be. And I'm not saying that it will be. I'm saying there are people that want it to be that way. America was founded so that it would never be a nation like that. And I believe there's still enough people in this country that would make it real hard for people like that to ever come to power. I believe God's blessing is still upon this country. But we need to understand these things. We need to understand what the folks out there want to do, so that we can cherish and hold dear the freedoms that we have and act upon them by following the true God and learning his commandments and teaching the word of God, the Bible, to others and to our children, so that they could bring it to the next generation and so forth. We should never take for granted these things. Now, that was what happened in Israel, is that a power rose up, a new religious system was instituted. It was illegal, punishable by capital punishment to follow the biblical faith. So people had to make a choice. It was called Hellenization because Hellenic is Greek culture. Now, let me just say this. I live right on the border of Tarpon Springs, Florida. Tarpon Springs is a Greek community. I love Greek people. We have tons of Greek people in our congregation. I have many Greek friends, and there's thousands of Greeks in our community. The best food. Jews and Greeks have a lot in common. We love to eat good food. We love to celebrate. We love to dance. We love to just celebrate life, be joyful about life. There's definitely a Mediterranean connection there. So this, what I'm saying here in the context of the Hanukkah story, has nothing to do with any kind of a negative slant against Greek people or Greek culture. I think pretty much everyone understands that, but you never know. But what we're talking about when we talk about Hanukkah was there was a portion of the Greek Empire that broke away, and I'm going to explain how that happened. It was all prophesied by Daniel, and it was centered in Syria and Babylon. It wasn't even in Greece, but Alexander expanded the Greek Empire from Greece all the way to India. And then when it broke apart, a portion of it became mighty, and we call it the Seleucid Empire or the Greco-Syrian Empire. Sometimes it's just referred to as the Syrians, other times the Greeks in the context of Hanukkah. But what happened was that they sought to bring in Greek culture, Hellenic culture. Now, there were many things about Greek culture that were and still are wonderful, and the Jews loved many of the aspects of Greek culture. For example, arithmetic, science, poetry, philosophy and history, math and science and the arts. All of these things were developed by the Greeks. Now, they learned it from the Egyptians, but they refined it, and they had an incredible working knowledge of the universe, and they were able to develop a very advanced and progressive society based on the knowledge that they had. And so there was a tremendous exchange between the Jews and the Greeks. The Greeks also admired the Jews very much for their wisdom, the spiritual truths that the Jews had. And many of the Greek philosophers had great admiration for the Jews. But there was also a dark side to that culture. It was a culture that was paganistic and idolatrous. It did not know the God of the Jews. It did not know the God of the Bible, the one true and only God. And so many false gods were worshipped. Homosexuality was rampant. One of the great practices of the Greeks was sports. We get sports from the Greeks. Football, basketball, baseball, I love them all. I love sports. I grew up playing sports and watching sports, and I still do. And it's wonderful. And Jewish people today are big sports fans. That's part of our culture. But in those days, the athletes trained in the nude in these gymnasiums. So it was a stumbling block for Jews to be athletes because the Greek culture, they ridiculed and ostracized people who were circumcised. It was, to them, it was a joke. And if you were circumcised, you were a laughing stock. I mean, people in public places like the gymnasium would laugh at you. And so it was even worse for Jewish businessmen because most of the business was done in the Greek baths. And if you went into a Greek bath and you were circumcised, then you'd be a laughing stock, and it would inhibit your ability to engage in commerce. We know all this from the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees is an apocryphal book. It didn't quite make it into the Bible. It is part of the Catholic Bible, interestingly, but it's not. It doesn't read exactly like Scripture, so I understand why it didn't make it in. But it's an historical book, and it's an accurate historical record. We can verify 90% of what's in there from secular history. Anyway, many of the Jews were so taken with Greek culture that they actually submitted themselves to reversal of their circumcisions, that surgery called epispasm, which was developed by really some brilliant Greek doctors. You got to understand, medicine in those days, we're talking 160s BC, was far more advanced than 1,000 years later during the medieval time. The Greeks could perform amputations on soldiers that were wounded in war. They could perform, they could suture wounds. They understood infections and on and on, far more advanced than 1,000 years later. Now, I do want to say, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the question box, and I'll try to get to them as we go on. But it was hard. So many of the Jews at that time assimilated into Greek culture. You see, they just decided, hey, if you can't beat them, join them. And so, plus they didn't want to lose their life. It was just too doggone dangerous to believe in the God of Israel, and it was too dangerous to keep the Sabbath and the feast and all these things. And then, they would rationalize in their head, who knows if these stories in the Bible are even true? Maybe it's just myth. I mean, did a God really open up the Red Sea and bring our people across on dry land and then swallow up the Egyptian army? Did that really happen? Was there really a Samson, and was there really a Noah who lived 900 years and so forth? The same kind of thinking that we see today, secular humanistic thinking. Secular humanism is not all bad. It put a man on the moon. You see, it can do great things. The industrial era, the technological, the information age. But without God, we're nothing. Without God, we're lost. That's why he gave us his scriptures. That's why he gave us his ways. That's why he gave Israel specifically these commandments, the Sabbath and the feasts, and where it's tzitzit and eat kashrut and circumcised, so that there's a people in the earth that is a sign that there is a God, and the things that he did in days of old, we're still doing all these things as a sign that our testimony is true. We're bearing witness to the things that the Bible says he did in days of old. And we're still here. We're still doing these things. And so the whole matter of Hanukkah is connected to the temple, liberating the temple so that the Messiah can come into it. But it was so dangerous, and there was such an outpouring of assimilation. And you have to wonder, where was Antiochus and the Greeks coming from in terms of their religious system? Why were they interested in the temple? He understood somehow, maybe it was just intuitive, I don't know, but he understood somehow that the temple in Jerusalem was the key to world power and world domination. And his idea was, hey, what we need is a religion that is accommodating to all. What we need is a world religion, something that everybody can be a part of. And what's important is not what goes on in the temple. What's important is getting people in the temple, getting people associated with this religion. It's called body count. And see, that's the thinking of world leaders, not only of Antiochus, but that's the thinking of world religious leaders all through the ages, right up to today. Body count, body count, body count. The more people you have in your meetings, the more that it justifies what you're doing, or so the thinking says. The mega congregation operates on that principle. It doesn't matter what you preach inside. It doesn't matter what you do inside the building or even outside the building with those who are affiliated with you. The important thing is that they're affiliated and that they come. Because thinking is that the numbers of people justifies everything else. Mega congregational thinking goes back to Babylon. It goes back to Greece and Rome, and it's still going on today. It went on all through the Middle Ages. The Roman Church was founded on that kind of thinking, but it's still going on today in Protestantism, in the Western world, and throughout the world, and elsewhere. Not that there's anything wrong with having crowds. I love crowds. But what I'm talking about is that mega congregation mindset, that nothing matters except body count. This is not God's way. And you see, this is what Antiochus brought into the land. This is what he set up. And he understood that the temple in Jerusalem was key. He seemed to understand that. And I want to pull up a scripture here to kind of speak to that. And the scripture is from 2 Thessalonians 2:4, and I dubbed it the anti-Messiah because that's what it's about, the Antichrist. It says, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for the day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the one destined to be destroyed." Now that's a reference to what is commonly called the Antichrist. And listen to what it says about him in the next verse. "He opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he sits in the the temple of God." He sits in the temple of God, proclaiming himself that he is God. Now, Antiochus seemed to understand this. He was not the Antichrist, but he is a type of the Antichrist if there ever was one. He went into the temple. He sacrificed in the temple, defiled it, set up the abomination that makes desolate. Now, in the book of Maccabees, it directly connects Antiochus to that verse that I just pulled from Daniel, the abomination that makes desolate. I don't have time to pull up all these scriptures, but that was a verse from Daniel, and Daniel said that that would happen, that someone would come into the temple and basically set himself up as God, take away the daily offering, and set up an abomination that makes desolate. And that was what Antiochus did. It seems that that's what the anti-Messiah will do. Set himself in the temple, remove the true worship, and set himself up as a God. But there's a promise from the prophet Malachi, who lived probably, nobody knows for sure the exact dates, but probably shortly after Daniel in the early 500s BC or late 400s BC. So he lived about 250 years before the events of Hanukkah, which again happened in 164 BC. And he says, "Behold, I am sending my messenger, and he will clear the way before me. Suddenly, he will come into his temple, the Lord whom you seek, and the messenger of the covenant, the one whom you desire. Behold, he is coming." So again, he will come into his temple, the Lord whom you seek, the messenger will come into the temple. So crucial to the thinking of the Jews, because they had this promise from the prophet Malachi, who is prophesying that the Messiah will come into the temple. The Lord whom you seek will come into the temple. The messenger, this is all a reference to Messiah. And so they knew that this had to happen. So where does a guy like Judah Maccabee get the wherewithal to lead a rebellion against this mighty army? I'll tell you about the Greco-Syrian army at that time. They outnumbered the Jews, some estimates as much as 20-1, others say maybe 10-1. They were a highly skilled, highly trained army. They rode upon elephants, which were like tanks, very hard to fight against an army like that. The Jews that fought against them were like guerrilla fighters, basically. They hid out in the wilderness. They used ambush tactics. They figured out ways to fight against the Greeks and against these riders on the elephants and all that. And Judah, whose name Maccabee stands for, it's an acronym for Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai, which means, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods. Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai, which comes from Exodus 15, from the Song of Moses. Maccabee also means the hammer. Judah was a bad Jew. You didn't mess with him. I mean, this guy had chutzpah. He was willing to fight. He was willing to lay it on the line. And all those thousands of followers that were with him, that went and lived in the wilderness and were willing to fight so that they could continue to study Torah, so that they could continue their traditions, that they understood somehow that God had given them these traditions. They understood somehow that God didn't do all this so that we would be wiped out as a race, and the very culture he gave us in the Sefer Torah would somehow cease from the earth. They understood that. It must be that God will continue to be with us. And so that's where they found the wherewithal to rise up. They knew they had that prophecy and many others, that a son of David would come to reign from the temple in Jerusalem and to reign over the earth for all time. And so they rose up, they liberated the temple. Upon liberation of the temple, they rededicated the temple. They cleaned it up, they purified it, and it was determined, hey, you know, we need to celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, because it's the most joyful, most important season of the year, and they hadn't done it in a while. So they took out the menorah, and they decided to celebrate for 8 days, because of the Feast of Tabernacles is 8 days. That's why it was 8. That's why it was 8 days. Now the legend, this is not found in the book of Maccabees, but it's a rabbinic legend from Talmud. It says they only had a tiny cruse of oil, enough for maybe 1 day, but the menorah stayed lit for 8 entire days. So that part of the Hanukkah story, whether it's true or not, people can debate that. The historical fact of the Maccabees rising up against the mighty Greco-Syrian army and liberating the temple, totally true. We know that from history. It happened. And interestingly, all of this was prophesied. And it was prophesied by Daniel. Again, if anyone has a question at this time, I will take it. If not, I'm going to move on. So feel free to submit your questions. Somebody asked, Rabbi Mike, will you please send me what Maccabee is? And I guess I just said that. So Mem, Chaf, Bet, Yud, Mi Chamocha Ba'elim Adonai. So there it is. Good question. And so I'm going to continue on here now. I don't have time to get into all the scriptures in Daniel. One of the series of scriptures that describes these events is from Daniel 8. I'll probably pull up one or two of them. I'm going to try to summarize it for you. First of all, know this, that Daniel prophesied in the 500s BC. Now, this was long before, several hundred years before the events of Judah Maccabee and company. So, some people, secular humanist scholars, tried to say that Daniel was a forgery, that it was a bunch of bull. But the reason that they tried to say that was because it's so perfect that it just describes what happened to a T. But this is what the Bible does. And we know that more and more today as Israel continues to be revived. The prophecies of old, whether it's Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, it's all coming to pass, and nobody can stop it, and nobody can explain it away. Newsflash, the Bible is true. Trust the Bible. Trust the Word of God. It's true. Now, Daniel prophesied the rise and fall of the Greek Empire under Alexander. And the way that it's described is Daniel has a vision of a ram, and the ram has two horns, and it's just going around conquering everything. And then all of a sudden this goat comes along, and the goat has a big prominent horn, one of them. And the goat goes and smashes the ram, destroys the ram. And now the goat is in charge. Okay? Now, I'm going to tell you right now that the angel Gabriel later comes to Daniel and tells him that the ram was Persia. Each of the horns on the ram was Persia and Media, which the Medes and the Persians were really one people. There are a few specific differences with the Medes, who were an Aryan race within Persia, but the two were so intertwined, they're generally just called Persia. The Persian Empire was the ram. And the angel tells him that the goat is Greece, and the one horn is a mighty king. Okay, now I'm going to pull up a screen share here so that you can see what I'm talking about in the book of Daniel. And as I said, I can't go through all of these scriptures, but the male goat, this is from Daniel 8:8. The male goat became exceedingly great, but as soon as he became mighty, the large horn was broken. Now remember, that large horn is the horn of the goat, and the goat is Greece. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. I'm going to back up. I'll back up one here. I'm talking about the ram again. He came up to the 2-horned ram that I'd seen standing beside the canal and charged it with raging strength. This is the goat attacking the ram. I saw him attacking the ram furiously, striking the ram, shattering his 2 horns. Again, this is Greece attacking Persia. Now, we know from history that this happened. The ram was not strong enough to stand against him, so he knocked the ram to the ground, trampled him. No one could rescue the ram from his power. As I said, we know from history this happened. Greece conquered Persia. Persia was once the mighty world empire that dominated the world. From India all the way to Greece, Persia ruled. And Persia today is Iran. Iran is the ancient, is the modern remnant of the ancient Persian Empire. They know that in Iran. Most Iranians that you meet today in America, they tell you that they're Persian. I think that's oftentimes, I don't know what the reasons are for that, but know this, that there are people in Iran, particularly the regime that's in charge there, that they believe that the Persian Empire is going to be revived. They believe that they're supposed to rule the world again, and they're darn sure trying. So that's what this nuclear deal's all about from their point of view. They're trying to snooker the United States, and don't trust a thing that they say. At least Benjamin Netanyahu's smart enough; he doesn't. But for some reason, some of the folks in power right now in America do trust them. I don't get it. Not smart. They're trying to rule the world again. They're trying to get nuclear weapons and use terror. They're the #1 supporter of terror in the world. Why anybody wouldn't recognize that, I don't know. But Greece destroyed the Persian Empire. How did that happen? Alexander the Great. Okay? Alexander was prophesied by Daniel. He's that horn on the goat. And what happened, Alexander was a young kid in his early 20s. He went off with about 50,000 Greek soldiers. And he had this drive, this passion, this vision. It was like he had a sense of destiny and calling and purpose. He knew that he was called to this. It didn't make a whole lot of sense because he was vastly outnumbered by the mighty Persian Empire of Darius. There's a great battle in the annals of war, and it's studied to this day at places like West Point, where Alexander fought Darius at the Battle of Gaugamela, and this is where he defeated the Persians. And there are different estimates, but some say that Darius's army was as high as 1 million versus Alexander's 50,000. Others say 250 to 350,000. Nobody's exactly sure about the numbers, but it's clear that Alexander's army was vastly outnumbered. So it was very difficult what he was doing. And his army employed some brilliant tactics that are still studied to this day. They also used something called a phalanx, which is a formation where the soldiers got real tight, shoulder to shoulder, and they held a shield. They held up shields, and then from the shield, they'd have this long lance. It'd be about 18 feet long sometimes. And they would move forward together, hundreds, even thousands of them in the phalanx formation. It's very hard to pierce through and kill anybody in there. And those big, long spears would just tear armies to pieces. So there's a lot more to that. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into it. I encourage you to study it if you're into that thing, the Battle of Gaugamela. But the bottom line is that Alexander understood that he had a calling, he had a destiny. It was God that raised Alexander. It was prophesied by Daniel long before. And I'm not saying Alexander was necessarily a follower of God or whatever. That's not really the point. But God used him, raised him up to take down the Persian Empire. And when he did that, he brought Greek culture to not only to that part of the world, to Asia Minor, and then to the former remnants of Babylon, but he pushed all the way to India. He made it all the way from India to Egypt, set up the city of Alexandria. Eventually, after that, he came into the land of Israel. There's a story in the reliable and trustworthy Josephus, who's a Jewish historian that lived shortly after Yeshua's time. He describes this story where when Alexander entered Israel, he actually bowed himself to the high priest of Israel when he saw the high priest dressed in his priestly garments, with his priestly attire and his hat and everything. And his generals were just flabbergasted by this, but he explained that he saw a vision of that priest when, in a dream, when he first went out on the mission to go and fight against the Persian empires. And somehow it was that vision that inspired him to go and do this to begin with. So he saw a vision of the high priest of Israel dressed in those royal garbs. Interesting, isn't it? I wonder who he actually saw. But God was directing him. And because of that, in Alexander's time, the people of Israel were treated gloriously. They were treated with kindness and respect. They were allowed to continue the temple service, and all of their practices were allowed. Even the Shemitah season was allowed, the Sabbaths and the feasts and the tithing system and everything. And Alexander was beloved of the Jews. And to this day, there's a lot of Jews who have the last name Alexander. And many also have taken the first name because he's kind of like a hero figure among the Jews. He represented from that point of view, the goodness of Greek culture. And Alexander was young. He was idealistic. He kind of had the idea of, there being like world peace, that he would be able to usher in world peace by conquering nations, but then allowing them the freedom to continue their culture and their ways. And that was what he did from the place that he went. Suddenly, age 32, he died. So the whole thing only lasted 10 years. We know all this from history. Now, when he died, his kingdom was broken up 4 ways. This is amazing because the prophet Daniel stated in Daniel 8, I'm going to pull up this verse here for you on the screen share so that you can all see it. The male goat became exceedingly great. Again, that's Alexander. But as soon as he became mighty, the large horn was broken. As soon as Alexander reached the peak of his kingdom, where he reigned from India all the way to Greece, his influence was throughout the whole world. Greek culture went throughout the whole civilized world. It was amazing what he accomplished in such a short period of time. It was supernatural. And it was all prophesied here. And by the way, the Jewish priests and scholars, when Alexander came, they had already recognized that he was the fulfillment of this prophecy of Daniel. They knew it. And they probably knew what was coming too. The large horn was broken as soon as he became mighty. As soon as he reached his peak, he died at age 32, mysteriously, of an illness. To this day, nobody's really sure what it was. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Folks, that's exactly what happened. His kingdom was broken up into 4 different parts, and there were 4 prominent horns, 4 prominent generals of Alexander that took over each of them. Out of one of them came forth a small horn, which grew extremely large to the south and the east. Now, this is a reference to the Seleucid kingdom, which is the one of the 4 kingdoms that later became Antiochus Epiphanes. You see, the Seleucid part of Alexander's former kingdom reigned from Syria all the way to the border of India, from Syria to the former kingdom of Babylon, and down to the south by Saudi Arabia as well. The second most powerful was Ptolemy, the Ptolemaic kingdom, which was in Egypt. The north and the south that Daniel describes also in another chapter of the warring between the north and the south, and the north prevails, is a description of the Seleucid and the Ptolemaic kingdoms fighting against each other. But it was the Seleucid kingdom that was the one that became the most mighty of the 4. It's described to a T, hundreds of years earlier by Daniel. It grew as high, now this is the weird part, it grew as high as the host of heaven, hurled some of the host and the stars down to the earth, and trampled them. It set itself up to be as great as the prince of the host. Now, what is it that the Antichrist does? Goes into the temple, sets himself up as God, as the Messiah. It took away from him the daily offering, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. So that's exactly what Antiochus did. He went into the sanctuary and he took away the offering, and he set himself up in the place of the true God, whose throne is in that sanctuary. He set himself up to try to make himself the ruler and the God of the peoples. So it's amazing that it's described in such detail, and it happened exactly as Daniel said, that and that was prophesied hundreds of years earlier. So I am sure that the Maccabees were students of the book of Daniel, and they understood what was happening. And Daniel goes on to say that his kingdom would be broken, and not by some human hand. And so it was that supernaturally Antiochus Epiphanes' kingdom was broken. And it was shortly after that that the whole thing fell apart, and those four former Alexandrian kingdoms they came under the dominion of Rome. When you get into the 1st century BC, Rome supplanted Greece as the #1 power in the world. Now that takes us to this verse, and this will be the last one that we look at tonight, but it's from John 10:22 in the New Testament. Now sometimes people say, well, where do you find Hanukkah in the New Testament? That's just some Jewish thing. It's not true. It's in the New Testament. It is true that it's a Jewish national celebration, okay? But Yeshua was keeping Hanukkah. John 10:22, then came Hanukkah. Many of the English Bibles say, then came the Feast of Dedication. As I said, dedication is Hanukkah. So then came Hanukkah, and it was winter in Jerusalem. Yeshua was walking in the temple around Solomon's colonnade. Then the Jewish leaders surrounded him, saying, how long will you hold us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us outright. So you see that what they wanted to know at that time, they were insisting, they wanted to know, are you the Messiah? And why? Because at Hanukkah, this is the question that comes into every person's mind who celebrates Hanukkah, Jewish or Gentile, but especially Jewish people, because we've been celebrating Hanukkah for so many years, and we're celebrating the resurrection of the temple, the rededication of it, but it was like life from the dead, but not just so that we could institute the worship in the temple again, which frankly we don't even have now anyway. So what are we doing it for now? What are we celebrating? Because you see, the temple wasn't liberated and rededicated just to worship in the temple again, but to pave the way so that Malachi's prophecy could be fulfilled, that the Messiah, the messenger, would come into the temple so that God's promise to David would be fulfilled. Because I guarantee you, when the Messiah comes and takes the throne of David, he won't sit in a mosque in a big gold dome in Jerusalem. It just won't be that way. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. He is not an egalitarian Messiah. And I want to tell you this, I think it's vitally important to be respectful to people of other religious traditions. Be respectful to people of other religious faiths they're just doing what they know. We who follow the God of Israel and his son Yeshua, we do not hate others who don't know him, but our calling is to take the light which he is and share that light with others. Yeshua said, Anochi or ha'olam, I am the light of the world. But he also said, interestingly, you are the light of the world. In every Hanukkah, there's the Shamash candle, which is lit first, and from that light, which represents the Messiah, the servant, every other candle is lit. The light in you is lit through the light which is the Shamash, the servant. It's the same light, but he's the servant. He's the right hand of the Lord. He's the branch. He's the vine. He's the light of the world. Let him shine in you. This is the message of Hanukkah. Let the light shine in you. The Messiah is coming back, and we're going to keep year after year celebrating that a great miracle happened there. We're going to keep celebrating it because even as the Maccabees liberated the temple so that Messiah could come in there and preach in the temple and heal in the temple and declare himself to be the Messiah in the temple, which he did, so too now this generation, the way is being prepared for Messiah to return to Jerusalem. And I don't know if the temple will be there before he returns or after. I don't know. I can only give you opinion on that. I think it's before, but we'll see. One way or another, he comes back. He will take the throne of David in Jerusalem. There will not be other religions in Jerusalem. There will not be Islam. There will not be Christianity in Jerusalem, not the kind that they have there now, which is pretty weird and dark. But there will be a messianic faith that flourishes throughout the earth. One God, one Messiah, and all the world will be filled with his glory. I hope that you and your family and your home is filled with his glory on this Hanukkah. Thank you for attending. Appreciate you being here tonight. I am going to end the webinar in a moment, just so you know. So I did want to just make a statement that if you feel like you were really blessed tonight and you'd like to give a blessing, give a donation, we could sure use your help. And I'm going to redirect you to the website, but it's templenewjerusalem.org, and you can give via PayPal, templenewjerusalem.org. And you can give a Hanukkah donation or your regular tithe or a special offering, whatever you'd like to do. We encourage donations. I appreciate you attending tonight, and it's been a blessing for me to share with you. Shalom, Shalom, Yerushalayim. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Happy Hanukkah, Chag Hanukkah Sameach. Shalom.